in a second.
Okay, and then should we set up the,
Well, I'll do the intro and then we'll go. You
Into the
wanted to say
PowerPoint.
some words and then the PowerPoint?
Sure.
Cool. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience and thanks for coming to this reading of Pestilence, issues 1 through 5 by Jack Waters, our dear friend. Give it up. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum. We are an all-volunteer independent queer bookstore that we founded back in 2012, and we have been here at the LGBT Center since 2014. Jeffrey is our volunteer helping us out today. Thank you, Jeffrey. Volunteers make it possible for us to do what we do. So we encourage you to look around afterwards, buy a book, make a donation, in some way support us so that we can keep hosting events like this and having a store like this, with exhibitions like this. By the way, we have a show of 28 photographers. It's called My Romantic Ideal, curated by Slava Magutin, and it's our summer exhibition. So these photos will be up through the end of August. And actually, some of the artists are going to be doing a walkthrough on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday at 6 p.m. So please join us for that. It should be really interesting and fun. So the Bureau has regular business hours, Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then we often stay open later when we have events. On weekends, we usually do events in the afternoons at a leisurely pace. And if you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that at the back of the room, or for those of you watching online, on our website, which is bgsqd.com. It's 5 letters. And you'll get an email every other Monday about our many upcoming events. Before I introduce Jack, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. The Bureau also recognizes Palestinian liberation as a fundamental part of our collective liberation. And we encourage you to read our flyer on why we feel it is important for queer people to speak out in solidarity with Palestinians. And that flyer is in the corner there. So please check that out. So let's get to it. Jack Waters' comic strip, Attack of the Murder Robins, is the back page of Uranus Comics number 3, Uranus Attacks, the 2023 anthology edited by Carlo Quispe. Jack is a member of the band Nyobs, the terminally queer-skinned noise god kitchen band. Jack co-wrote and performed the title role of Jason Holiday in the acclaimed indie film Jason and Shirley. Jack's films have shown internationally and broadcast on Sundance Channel and PBS. In 1995, Jack's own film, The Male Gaze, screened in the cinema section of the 1990 exhibition Black Male, Representation of Masculinity in American Art at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Waters and life partner Peter Kramer, former co-directors of ABC No Rio, are co-founders of Le Petit Versailles, a New York City green thumb urban garden presenting screenings, music, performance, visual art, exhibitions, and new media. Please give Jack a very warm welcome.
hello and thanks for coming. Today I'm going to present Pestilence Comics 1 through 5. The series is designed to be a set of 10, 7 of which are completed, and then the following 3 will be completed in time. I don't really have a schedule for it because I create the comics as time goes by. And in relationship to the whole point of the comics, which was created as a companion to the 3-part opus, also titled Pestilence. So the comics work in part as a form of inspiration, and they also work in a way of a storyboard, because as you heard, I am also a filmmaker, and I think and I create visually. So the comic books correspond not chronologically necessarily, or not directly, but visually to the sections and scenes that happen in Pestilence. I describe as a multimedia musical opus, which is my way of saying opera. But my feeling about what the operatic approach is goes back to the original design of what operas were, which is taking what was the most current in both art, performance, science, and technology. So if you go back to some of the works of Mozart, particularly I always think of The Marriage of Figaro, which was basically an anti-imperialistic doctrine. But it's also amusing, and it's lyrical, and it's very beautiful. So this is what I hope to do with Pestilence. As it would seem, the idea of pestilence is predicated on the idea of plague, epidemic, and pandemic. And so the backstory in my mind around pestilence was referring directly to the AIDS epidemic. But as it happened, we staged the first part of this 3-part opus at La Mama in the winter of 2019-2020. And it was just on the cusp of COVID. We had no idea that COVID was happening, and we were very lucky that we finished the run. And as soon as the run finished, people were blaming us for causing COVID. Joking, but it was kind of a weird coincidence. But then my idea of what plague and pestilence is something that is always occurring, that it's universal, and has been happening since time immemorial. And that it doesn't necessarily have to be bad. I think of Nietzsche a lot with his book Beyond Good and Evil, so that things happen. And the idea of calling things good or bad for me is very binary, and I try and stay away from that. I just like to look at things as they are. So when I think of pestilence, I think of disease, I think of contamination, I think of bacteria, like all of the things that basically propagate. And amazing things propagate, like amazing things come from amazing things. Also amazing things come from decline. I also, as you heard, am a gardener. My garden is called Le Petit Versailles. So I also think of compost. So that as things die and as things rot, they become the fertile material for other things to grow. So this is also embedded into this idea of what pestilence is. Pestilence also deals with what I was saying about my view of binary thinking, where things are not left and right, black or white, right and wrong, but they also operate and cooperate into the generation of new and different things. And as a species, sometimes it's happy for us. But if we look outside of our species, and we think that we will all eventually become fertilizer for something eventually, then what might not be immediately happy for us is productive and developmental for something else that we don't necessarily know. So that said, there is a linear aspect to pestilence which looks at the beginnings and also the end of things as far as we can conceive. And I recognize that our ability to conceive of things are limited to our little human brains. And so the idea of just presenting things and putting things out in the open letting them ferment and letting them percolate is also part of what I see as the spectacle of what Pestilence is. So I'm going to take you through issues 1 through 5, which are sold here at the Bureau. They're sold individually as individual issues, and they're also sold as a set, which is a set of 5 at this point. I did bring 6 and 7 for anyone who's interested to look at it, but we're going to focus on 1 to 5, which I see as like a series in and of itself, which basically encompasses all of the ideas and themes of the opus in general, and then also as of the comic book series itself. So, I tend to be very detailed in a lot of ways, but as a performer, I also like to think that I'm very simple. And what you see is basically what you have right now. There's probably more, but I also like the idea of sharing, and so I hope people will work with me in garnering and cultivating and developing what that more might be, as well as what the prospect and aspect of simplification can be. So I see the visuals are up. I'm going to pull up a chair.
Do you want me to flip the lights off?
Sure, why not? I'm a big Sunset Boulevard fan, so I like this idea of everyone sitting together in the dark. So let's see. I'm gonna. Can everyone hear me? I mean, I'm also a big sucker for the mic, but I think this might be a little cumbersome to. Oh no. All right, let's see what we can do with this, just for the sake of amplification. So this is where we are, and you see, I guess we see the screen sharing mode, and this is new system for me. So I'm going to try and walk through this PowerPoint. There we go. So part 1 is called generator. And again, we're looking at this idea of biological production, but I'm also looking at the aspect of mechanics. I think of Freud a lot, the way Freud developed his psychological system out of mechanisms. And so you have like all kinds of mechanisms that are based on mechanics as Freud started to develop at the beginning of the age of industrialization. So generator, it's just like a birth, is a beginning, is a point of creation. And so I'm starting from, as I like to say, single-celled organisms to the end of culture as we know it. And so in that sense, generator starts in the pre-verbal. But for me, in order to get to the pre-verbal, I like to start with a lot of words. So the words themselves also point to nonverbal. And this is why I'm asking to think, if you can, that we could overcome the conundrum of imagining that which cannot be conceived. So it's kind of the very start and the beginning of things as I am able to conceive. Now let go of nothing and imagine everything. We are beyond knowing or caring why this happens. A light, a collision, an energetic shift, heat. So as I said, I'm thinking of the opera, I'm thinking of the origins of opera, where I was talking about this 16th, 17th century aspect of the development of these musical and performative deliveries, which was based on what was available at the time. But at the same time, one of my influences for Pestilence, the opus, is Robert Wilson's Einstein on the Beach. And I was looking at Robert Wilson's collaborator, And wait, who am I thinking of? Bob Wilson. And it's said that Bob Wilson started collaborating with Philip Glass, the composer, by doing drawings. And so I thought I would try and start with the same thing. And so I did a series of charcoal drawings. And that's really the basic format of Generator Pestilence comic #1. So it's kind of a hybrid of a comic book and a picture book. And these are the drawings that I conceived of that are charcoal drawings on rag paper that I then put into print. And for me, there are these aspects of void, nothingness, but then there's clearly a big bang, and out of darkness, this sense of light. We are one in pulsation, throbbing. We undulate in obedience to the extreme variations in temperature. Our pulsation becomes so violent that a rift occurs. So, we have these little cells, and I'm gonna stop interpreting and just kind of go with what you see. And at this point, I'm sampling from the opera. This is Pestilence Part 1, also Generator, as performed at La Mama, which I spoke about. So we're doing multimedia. My collaborators, Christopher Roberts, John Schwartz, who was primarily in music, basically emulated the drawings that I had. Similarly to what I was saying about Robert Wilson and Philip Glass, they took my drawings and they visualized them. So this was how we started. Music is by the band that I play with called Nyobs, as you heard. And John Schwartz is one of our band members and also a very experienced and a very good composer. So John's role was primarily as what we call the composer, but our roles kind of shift because we're all doing pretty much everything. So that's a sample. So that's a little part of part 1. The second comic book is called Development, because what else comes after generation but development? So from these single cells, and this is the other thing that I'm playing around with and working with Pestilence, is this amalgamation of religion, science, and history. And so in that aspect of religion, I'm using mythology, and I'm also using the imagination, dream life, because I'm also highly influenced by Dada and surrealism. So this idea of dream life and the subconscious is something that I play with. So, we'll continue, but these are the images that come at the very early stages of development. I should say that while I'm talking about linearity and chronology, I'm also going back and forth a lot. I'm going from like primal stage to the future, because I think, again, they're all one and the same. And so I'm visualizing them and imagining them within this comic book series. So I kind of like this, this creature, this sort of like, it's a blob, basically, but you're seeing all of these wormy creatures, you're seeing snaky things. Slime plays a lot into this whole pestilence cycle. So this is another sample also from part one, where these amorphous beings start to develop into organisms.
Aging horsemen snatching up boys and girls, chairs, some with wings that sway apprehension and delight. You know where they take these children? It is an initiation.
So within that context, we have like these lizard-like creatures that have evolved from these organisms and then eventually become creatures very much like ourselves, also very unlike ourselves, that social anthropologists and biologists call hominids. Hominids are pre-human. And so from the research that I did with developing this concept, there are hominids and then there are hominids. This is a big argument that we're finding in anthropology. This idea, we have the Africa as an origin theory, which has been the prevailing theory for a century, really, at least. But it's recently been refuted that hominids have developed all over the planet. And we're finding elements that some, like ourselves, are very peaceful and very loving, very sexual, and then others not so much. So this, the other thing that I deal with is that like life and consciousness itself, there is this idea of aggression. Because in order to live, in order to survive, there's the hunting. Of course, there's agrarian farming, but you're still growing things in order to kill and to eat them. So these groups of hominids, I'm imagining, that come from some research, is this idea of hominids that are very violent. And they traveled and found other groups of hominids. So in this particular sequence, you have a group of these aggressive hominids, and they come upon a group of more passive and more chill pre-human creatures. And so the one group of hominids on the upper right-hand side think, oh, here's some people to come and make love to us, and we can join them. But no, the aggressive hominids just want to kill them. And a lot of that has to do with biology itself, where this idea of perpetuating the species has to do with killing off other aspects of the species, so that this idea of just survival becomes this idea that you have to destroy other things. Whether that's true or not is really up to you to decide. So yeah, they meet the hominids, they basically kill them, and then they go off in search of more to sustain their breed. So again, we're going back to these kind of imaginative creatures. There's centaurs, there's like half human, half beastly things. And it all becomes this kind of like hodgepodge of things that we have no record of, and we have no way except for our imagination. And so, we think of mermaids, we think of flying creatures, and so forth and so on. So these are the things that we depict within this part 2 generation. So this idea of the centaurs is very Greco-Roman. This idea of, the centaurs also capturing and slaying usually very young people. And what they do with them, this is what we're depicting. You see in the lower left corner is a figure that is a snake-like, is a creature that is largely feminized, and she has snaky hair. And this is where I depart from this Greco-Roman aspect of it, and I look more into African traditions. There's a figure that scholars look at, they call Metis, and there are caves in Libya where Metis was mostly known and worshipped. And the cave drawings show this like snake-like hair. And so it said that snakes have the tendency to be poisonous and to kill, but snakes can also be healing. So again, it comes into this dichotomy or this like homogenation of like life and death, violence and nonviolence. And so here the Metis figure starts to appear in comic book number 2. So here she is again. She's a little more developed. She's a healer and a destroyer all in one. But now we start to have tribes, and they all contributed to the bounty. Then one day a stranger came into their midst. They were neither surprised nor disappointed at the intrusion. So again, we go back into this figure that I call in turn a narrator, but it also goes back into this African storytelling tradition, which is Anansi. And Anansi is a figure that in many cases is neither male nor female, sometimes both male and both female, and sometimes not really sexed at all. And in this particular configuration, I have this narrator figure who's basically like reiterating like those opening passages of the part 1. And we're now commingling, we're having the beginning of what I conceive of the possibility of gender. And so we have these ungendered creatures, and they are basically living their lives, but they're beginning to be social. So their families, their tribes, and similarly to the hominid invasion, we have more detailed and more sophisticated interactions. And so the aggression and the passivity start to play out in ways that are much more detailed. We start to become more lingual, there's more language. And so this is like where the comic book bubbles start to come in, where you see all of these creatures beginning to speak. And so, they're basically wondering, like, what is happening? Like, how is it possible that they had not seen this coming? Again, we go into the mist and the primordial imaginative sphere where we're adrift. And again, there's a lot of wonder that it was bound to happen. And there's curiosity. There's a figure, and again, she's a goddess, but she's also like a creative aspect that is divine and at the same time human. And like us, she's curious. And what have we here? What happens next? So we're going back into these kind of fish-like amphibian creatures. But at the same time, we're going into this sky, and we think, go away and come back to it. We're seeing about seeing. We're looking at like these myths of Narcissus, where we see the figure in the middle column, which is basically a creature that's seeing basically a reflection of themselves. And so we're now leaning towards this idea of companionship and partnering. And so we're discovering desire. We're discovering togetherness, and it's a kind of one-on-one thing, but we're still looking at this idea of living as what will eventually become a society. At the same time, we're looking at consciousness. We're looking at self-awareness, and we're getting back to the origin of language. And we're looking at what our bodies do and how our bodies create language. And again, we're looking at our physical bodies and what we do with our thumbs and what we do with our fingers. And so once we have a finger, we have something to point with, which is not just recognizing ourselves, but it's also recognizing the others. And so this is what's happening here, is the development of language. And we're also thinking of this consciousness of time itself, where we experience things that we like to think are happening from one instance to the next, but because of our imagination, because of our dream life, and because of our ability to create myth and stories and narrative, we're moving backwards and we're moving forwards. Again, this idea of self and other starts to appear, where I am you and you are me. So here we are, and we're looking at Anansi. Anansi is also often figured as a spider. And so in my imagination, the spider is a beatnik, and the spider is telling their story in a cafe, a coffee shop. I'm thinking of, like, beatnik era, like 50s, where the Anansi in African myth usually has like a jug, has like a urn. But this one, in this Anansi is playing a drum, and everyone's saying, tell us a story. Anansi says they're going to make the jug sing. So that's it. And everyone's just kind of like huddling around, because we're now also looking at music, starting with the beat. So that's development. Second part of development now takes a jump, where we go into ancient Egypt. So again, Egypt I'm looking at as like this crux of civilization as we know it, where Egypt is an African culture. It's situated on the continent of Africa, but at the same time is influenced by places that are as far as people can travel. And so we saw with the early hominid phase, they're traveling by boat, they're walking, but at the same time, we're looking backwards to Metis. And Metis is basically saying the things that I've said before. But now that we're in Egypt and we're looking at the conjunction of Egypt and Africa, we're again looking at historical and anthropological discoveries where there is a warrior named Pai, or Pianki. And Pianki Pai was situated in this area that is commonly known as Nubia, but we now know Nubia is a very wide territory. And what we're seeing from the documentation and from the drawings is that the culture was very much situated in what we now know as modern day Sudan, North Africa. And that part of North Africa was at one point colonized by the Egyptian civilization, by the early period of Egyptian civilization. And so this is where we start to commingle history and mythology. Pi, we know, was real, was an actual figure. We have like the stelas, these carved slabs where people in high positions would carve out their story so that we know that they existed. So Pi the warrior is coming in, but at the same time, we're looking at the Egyptian pantheon, where we see Isis, who is one of the most powerful, highest figures. And so I'm seeing Isis as also being a configuration and amalgamation of this Metis figure, but then we're also seeing the offspring. And whether that happens by what had previously been cell division, we have these myths of who is it, Athena coming out of the skull of Zeus. Sometimes they're seen as siblings, sometimes they're seen as spouses, but we're still seeing like this development and this generation. So we're looking at the Osiris story, we're looking at the Horus story, we're looking at Osiris in relationship to Isis and all of their sisters and brothers. So Amen, Ra, this whole discovery of solar culture as opposed to lunar culture, where we're looking at daylight and the sun as being like the testament of what time and life is. But we still also have these lunar philosophies and these lunar lives. And many people associate this idea of solar culture with masculine and maleness, and lunar as being the domain of the feminine. So the Egyptian gods and goddesses are playing out these things, both celestially as well as within their relationships to each other. So now we get into the nitty-gritty of things. We're looking at the contendings of Horus and Set. And as I said, in some tellings, Set is like a god of darkness. Some people look at Set, sometimes pronounce Seth, as like evil and destructive. But others look at this idea of destruction, as I was saying, as just a way of reforming things and creating a situation where from out of chaos and violence, other things can happen. But in this story, which is a very old Egyptian tale, Horus and Set are enemies, and they've been in battle for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So these panels are showing just what the contendings are, from Set chopping up Horus's father, who was Osiris, into 14 pieces. Isis eventually finds all of those pieces and puts them together long enough to regenerate, and that was really seen as the birth of Set. But so Set, who could be Horus's uncle, or his father, really depending on what reading you look at. But Egyptian hieroglyphs and some of the papyrus tell us that Set was really into Horus's ass. Like Horus had a really beautiful ass, and he wanted it. And Horus is kind of configuring this thing. Horus probably doesn't know, but then maybe he does, and he's like, "Wait a minute, aren't you my uncle?" Like, whether that's bad or good, it's not mine to say. I'm just reading this the hieroglyphs as such as they're translated. So Set asks Horus, like, what can I offer for a piece of that sweet butt? And Horus says, well, I'll give you a piece of my ass if you give me some of your power. Now, I'm not making this up. These are things that's written. So Horus agrees, and there's a whole other story that I'm not gonna tell you because it's written in other places and also in the comic book. But you can see what's happening in the pictures. So yeah, we come to the Kushite invasion. The Kush is also another name for this kingdom that was placed in this wider realm of Nubia. And so this is where Pianki or Pi has come from. And as I said, they were colonized by ancient Egypt. Egypt went into a period of decline after, like hundreds and hundreds of years after they had basically imparted like the Egyptian culture and the Egyptian religion. And so at this point, the Kushites, who were very rich in gold, created their own kingdom, which very much emulated the Egyptian kingdom. And when they saw that Egypt was going into decline, this warrior, Pi, said, okay, well, I'm going to march into Egypt and I'm going to set things right. So again, we have this idea of violence and aggression as a means to kind of create an order from it. So these are also things that I'm just imagining, the relationship between Pianki and his soldiers, But we do know that part of the ritual for conquering Egypt and becoming a pharaoh had to do with bathing in the river and going through this whole ritual, which kind of combined the godhead of the solar energy, which at that point was looked at as Ra and Amen. Sun god had many names: Arman, Amen, Ra, and so forth, depending on when and where you're picking up the story. So this is what's happening here. It's similar to, and I should say, the pestilence story is very cyclical. Things repeat, but on each repetition, things get more complex. So, here are the people, they're talking about the corruption of Egypt. We're looking at archaeological and historical findings where the Nile itself stopped flowing. So there was no food or rice. And so some people say, well, this is part and parcel to why and how Egypt had deteriorated culturally. So I'm telling the story on the snake. The snake is telling this whole story. And then you're also looking at the various interactions and interrelationships of what happens. And so this imaginary relationship between Pi and one of her warriors, and the warrior, as Pi is getting ready for the ritual, says, "Oh, you smell sweet." And they sort of have this embrace, and finally Pi is like, "Okay, gotta get down to business, I must go." A warrior's work is never done. It's showtime. So again, we're looking at what happens as the bras bonded. It's the Opet festival, which is this ritual where in order to become a pharaoh, you have to go through all of these transformations, which include bathing in the water of the Nile and so forth. But Metis and her sisters have another idea in mind. So we have this godhead that is intervening in what we know as historical fact. And she's thinking, maybe we should all go down to Karnak and see what's up with this initiation ritual. These dudes are celebrating their ritual unification, solar power as monotheism. They would break us into pieces as if they were one, as if we were, oh wait, I can't see this. Can someone read this? Oh. Well, they're just looking at this idea of sun and moon, as if we were the moon and they were the sun. So they're looking at this idea of solar and lunar relationship. But then we go back to this whole idea of this amorphous aspect of creativity, and the Metis-Isis coalition merge into a single cell with multiple nuclei. So the creatrix in their wisdom bade Pianke that the time would come when the Kushites could go, and both Egypt, upper and lower, would return to Naphtha. So these are all of the places, I'm just naming all of the places where these rituals and historical facts, as we know them, happen. Going to comic book number 3, I call Leaving the Castle. So we jump again in time to the medieval period. In this medieval period, there is this relationship between the leading warrior and between the warrior's spouse, consort. I'm calling a knight and a dame. And this is something else we know from history, is that there were long and continue to be long histories where the women are basically ruling and leading. But then there is this weird, and this is also part of my search for Pestilence, is why this happens and what it is in the literature that we have. I strongly believe that the literature that really perpetuated the feminine aspects of things were not necessarily communicated in language as we know it. I also believe that there are a lot of things that were deliberately destroyed. We know this, we know that like from culture to culture, previous cultures are annihilated so that the present and dominating culture can say that this is really the way things are and the way things have always been. So this is what's happening in this interaction with the knight and the dame. And they're looking out the window and the knight's like, look who's here. And she's, don't try and distract me. And there are rare moments of tranquility amidst this turmoil. So again, he's saying distraction is just what you want. They're just, he's just trying to calm her down because he's got to go into battle and she's got to run the castle. And so that's what's happening in this chapter. They basically are looking at this courtier or troubadour, and the troubadour I'm looking at is like a latter-day Mick Jagger type rock star figure. And the troubadour is coming into the castle. They're both into him. And troubadour is like outside playing his lutes, like la 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 la. The dame's like, yoo-hoo, she wants him. So the troubadours are invited in. They have a feast in the banquet hall, and then they all end up in the bedroom. There's this three-way that's happening between the knight, the dame, and the troubadour. And again, we're going back into this like self against other, where this time it's between the knight and the dame, where you are me, I am you. So this idea of union, of selfhood and otherness start to play out. But this time it's this like three-way happening in this imagined medieval consortium. To be continued. This is the story of Pestilence. Everything is to be continued. Like every comic book is potentially split up into like infinite like comic books because the story is never really told. Number 4 again, we take a jump. I call it passages. And this is now happening in the age of pre-industrialism, where we have commerce, we have shipping, we have sales. And with that brings a culture of leisure. So it means that some people have free time. And the question is, what are you going to do in your free time? So you here have like this thing that apparently happened in Europe. I'm looking at France in particular, Paris specifically, where apparently like one of the favorite pastimes with the new leisure class was taking your turtle for a stroll on Sunday. This really happened. So we're now getting specific. There's like a specific person of leisure class, but this person also is coming from like intellect and writing. Is a writer, philosopher, and a book collector. And his housekeeper is saying, no reason to sit about on such a beautiful Sunday. You'll be walking the turtle then. So we go into detail about this like turtle walking activity. But at a certain point, this particular person finds themselves in a very threatened and endangered position. And this is where we start to look at this aspect of difference, race and nationality, where coming from a particular class or a particular segment puts you in danger. So here's this person trying to escape, basically. They go to this point in a place in Spain. It was like the border of Spain, Parbu, to try and escape like the occupation. And okay, like lift the veil of mystery. It's basically like the Holocaust and the persecution of Jews, And the person that we're looking at is modeled on the figure Walter Benjamin. And so Benjamin, who I don't name in the comic book because it's a very well-known story, is at this crossroads. And he's thinking about his book collection, like, what about my books? And his housekeeper's like, don't worry about your goddamn books. I'll take care of them. Just escape. Just get out of here because they're going to kill you. So there's like a very unfortunate situation that happens. I think it's pretty common, no reason to reiterate. But at Parbu was not a happy ending for Walter Benjamin. And so we know there's a mystery that's happening around the briefcase that Benjamin always clutched to himself, even at the border, that disappeared. Eventually turned out, but I kind of like this suitcase idea. You know, I'm fascinated with this idea of containers and mystery and secrecy. So that's that sequence. You know, then there's like actually Benjamin himself going, what the fuck? We go back into a mystical passage, and this is a fairy tale or a myth that I made up. I call Pimp and Trade with Divine Intervention. And so I create these like triads and you know, quartets of these figures that I'm calling the deity of deed, that's action, deity of word, which of course is speech, and then a deity of change, which is kind of an intermediary between this idea of action and speech. And so they are these mystical, godlike figures that preside over two figures, which again become part of this coupling. One is a bourgeois, I guess, decadent, and the other is, I guess we could say, is his hustler or partner. And the bourgeois has the power of language and speech. He talks a lot. And then his lover doesn't speak at all. It's like his body and his silence that becomes his power. So this idea of like, what is power and how does power manifest is played out in this section. So again, you know, there are just like different panels and different sections where the deities are whispering into the minds of like the pimp and the trade and telling them what to do and how to behave by using their powers of speech or non-speech and beauty and body in order to prevail. And then end of the section is the deity of change, who tells us the obvious, which is that everything changes. You know, so they have more whispering and, you know, there's all of this like jealousy and confrontation where Pimp eventually says, you think you've won, don't you? Well, it ain't over till the fat lady sings. And this again was like performative. I'm taking the comic books from live interactions by putting on performances and shows. And I thought that it would be interesting to show them in drawings, but from the drawings, they start to develop into more photographic representation. And so it's kind of like a reveal in a lot of ways, or taking off your comic book cartoon skin and showing like what your actual like human flesh might look like to the casual viewer. And I always like that line from the Marx Brothers, what was it, A Night at the Opera, where Groucho Marx says, it ain't over till the fat lady sings, which is one of my other influences, which is Wagner. You know, Wagner, who has the figure of Brunhilde, who is a goddess, and generally or frequently, she's a big lady because she's got a big voice, and you know, she's gonna have a big instrument to do it. And Groucho was like, well, the opera's over when the fat lady sings. Going into comic book number 5. Comic book number 5 is inspired by the marriage of heaven and hell, which of course is like the treatise that's written by Blake. Blake says what I said in the beginning with this idea of like good and bad, evil and niceness need each other. So marriage of heaven and hell is basically about this like anti-binary treatise where like God needs the devil to exist and the devil needs God to exist. So I'm doing it as a TV talk show. It's old school talk show. I'm thinking Dick Cavett, not David Letterman, but Susskind. When I was growing up, talk shows like you could. What's that?
Johnny Carson.
Carson, I feel like was the end of the talk show where, you would have writers, you would have like Gore Vidal coming on, and then you'd have like Proposition, the puppet show, so you'd have this like interrelationship between like so-called high art and low art. And I feel like the Carson show was kind of the beginning of the end, where we think of talk show as being something that's less variety and more like spectacle. I mean, I think they still point to this idea of Punch Judy, like these kind of violent and amusing interactions of entertainment. But yes, this is what's happening. And so there are 2 philosophers, and they agree to go onto this talk show just to talk about what their relationship is. Again, it's like a devil figure and a Jesus figure, but they're in a relationship. And so the talk show host like wants to know, how does this work? Like, let's like tell the audience like what's going on with your relationship. And they're really reluctant, because they are both philosophers, and so they're more interested in showing and telling people, how things work, not just in their relationship, but how they see things working within human interaction. So one brings a figure that's called the scapegoat, and another brings a figure that's called the geisha. And they're going to illustrate what happens. So they bring the scapegoat on, and we have these 2 characters that are watching the TV show, and then we have the interaction of the talk show host, and the host is, of course, very probing. He says, well, what do you say when people accuse you of being, Jesus interrupts, of being holier than thou? Talk show host, are you afraid of giving that impression? Christ, I don't give a damn. And then we go back to the viewers, these like the TV audience. So they're talking about setting up, they're going to bring on the hosts. The first guest that they bring on is the scapegoat. But they also are continuing to have this interaction, where they're saying, set up your performers after the station break. And then, of course, like the Christ and devil figure are just sort of putting together like what they're actually going to present. He says, we don't mind giving them what they want as long as they get what they deserve. Talk show host, everybody knows that good and evil are opposite sides of the same coin, but they still want to see a show. So, okay, they get a show, but in between we have these like treaties and things that are happening within both of their heads. And one is about detail and articulation, and the other is just about simplicity. And they're merged together. Some of it is printed text, others is handwritten text, which goes back to this idea of like what happens cerebrally and then what happens with our body. And so my goal is that the reader kind of takes that, not just literally with the actual words that are written, but get to see, because it's a comic book, and because they're drawings, is to look at the actual texture of not just the images as they're figured, but actually what the written word is. And this is why I'm looking at these things like stelas and papyrus and hieroglyphs, because the actual physical texture of the material plays out a lot. And this is what my goal is with the comic books, is that when you touch the comic books and you read them, as opposed to seeing them digitally on a screen, there's like a different, I'm not going to say meaning, but that there is hopefully like a different experience that happens when you actually, your hands are on the books and when your eyes are on the pages. So this is kind of what this spread is about. And again, just having a lot of fun with drawing. And again, for me, it's this kind of like intersection of words and images, of thought and of action. And this is now all happening within this media platform, and how that plays out in media, which again, like they're broadcasting. First guest they bring out, of course, is the scapegoat. And they're putting the scapegoat into the audience. They're basically performing a sacrifice. It's a media sacrifice. And so the audience essentially ravages the scapegoat. The question again is for the viewer to decide, like, does the scapegoat want this to happen? Is the scapegoat enjoying this? You know, I'm going to, again, leave it up to you to decide. We kind of go back into this classical painting. There's this period of like pre-romanticism where a lot of these things were played out in painting. And so I'm taking these paintings and then reiterating them in my comic book format. So at this point, the scapegoat happens. I call this section the rape of the scapegoat. And again, I'm looking at this idea of rape and what rape and violation is. There are aspects of myth and history where we think of things like Helen of Troy. There are things that happen in Greek mythology. And again, historians say, well, sometimes relationships happen, but the families or cultures that are coming from the opposite ends of these relationships are figured as like not wanted. And so the idea of rape itself, for me, starts to become a question. And I think it's very salient, obviously, right now, like this idea of what consent and volition and will is, both in terms of the desired and the figure that's desiring, and who has the power and the strength, and what kind of strength that is. Hence the geisha, which we know are, or were, like very intelligent, sophisticated, and highly trained artists, but they were positioned as servants in a big way. So my geisha is coming onto the TV audience and basically telling you who she is. And like a lot of the figures in the Pestilence cycle, similarly to Pai and Bra, like there are many different names for many different figures. And the naming itself starts to become interesting in a lot of ways, because whatever name we're calling a given figure tells something about like what they do, how they do it, and what the response is from the doing. So geisha goes back to this idea of change. And she is basically creating this mystical transformation, not just for herself, but hopefully for the audience. And so that's, again, done visually, just in the way that she transforms into these bursts of light. You know, we see some of these things that happen within Japanese tradition, within like these geisha traditions. But she's saying ultimately that there is a process of becoming. And just like that, the show was over. And the monkey's dead. That's the show business expression. We told you this was going to be a life-changing experience, and it was. Next time we'll have blah, 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 blah. And that's it. That's 1 through 5. So yeah, I'm going to be here. Can answer any questions that you have. I kind of feel like the show host, like the show is over. Or is it just beginning? This is why I like the mic.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Thank you, online audience.
How did you hear that?